Danny Foster stared out the window of the transport ship and watched Earth grow smaller behind him, and his stomach twisted with nerves and excitement, all mixed together, and he still could not believe this was really happening. 6 months ago, he was working at a warehouse in Cleveland and living in a tiny apartment and eating ramen 3 times a week. And then the aliens arrived and everything changed, and Earth joined something called the Galactic Council, and suddenly there were job postings. For normal people to go to space, Danny applied as a joke, and somehow he got accepted. Now he was on his way to Zenith 7, which was a massive trade station that floated in neutral space between dozens of different alien civilizations, and his job was simple, and all he had to do was exist and answer questions about human culture and help alien businesses understand what Earth might want to trade. The other humans on the transport were all excited and chattering about what aliens they might meet, and Danny tried to share their enthusiasm, but mostly he felt like he was going to throw up. When the transport docked at Zenith 7, 3 days later, Danny pressed his face against the window and his jaw dropped. The station was enormous, and it looked like someone had taken a dozen cities and stacked them in a spiral pattern around a central core, and lights glittered everywhere in colors Danny had never seen before, and ships of every shape and size drifted in and out like bees around a hive. An automated voice announced docking procedures in 15 different languages, and Danny grabbed his single duffel bag and followed the other humans through the airlock. The moment he stepped onto the station proper, the noise hit him like a wall. Aliens of every description filled the concourse, and some walked, and some floated, and some skittered on multiple legs, and the air smelled like cinnamon and ozone and something sweetly floral, and vendors shouted in languages that made Danny's translator implant work overtime. A tall blue alien with 4 arms checked his credentials and handed him a data pad with his quarters assignment and orientation schedule, and wished him good fortune in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. Danny found his room after getting lost twice, and it was small but clean, with a bed and a desk and a window that looked out over one of the station's market districts, and he unpacked his few belongings and tried not to feel overwhelmed. His orientation officer was a friendly alien named Zix, who looked like a walking stick insect but with kind eyes. And Zix explained the basics of station life and where to find food and how to use the credit system, and warned Danny that humans were very popular right now. Danny asked what that meant. Zix made a clicking sound that the translator turned into a laugh and said that humans were new and exotic and many species found them fascinating, and Danny should expect a lot of attention, and most of it would be harmless curiosity, but he should report any harassment immediately. Danny nodded and filed that away and figured he could handle some stares. The next morning he went looking for breakfast. The station had hundreds of food vendors, but Zix had recommended a cafe called the Nebula Rest that served food compatible with human biology, and Danny found it tucked into a corner of the market level, and it smelled amazing. The cafe was busy with a dozen different species sitting at tables, and Danny spotted an empty seat near the window and started heading toward it. That was when he saw her. She was behind the counter preparing drinks, and she was unlike anything Danny had ever seen, and she had the body of a woman, but her skin was covered in short silver white fur with black stripes, and her ears were pointed and fuzzy and sat on top of her head, and they swiveled to track sounds, and a long striped tail swished behind her as she worked. She looked up and her eyes met Danny's, and they were the most striking shade of violet, and her pupils were vertical slits like a cat. For a moment they just stared at each other, then her ears perked straight up, and her tail went rigid, and her pupils dilated until they were huge black pools with just a thin ring of violet around the edges. She dropped the cup she was holding and it shattered on the floor, but she did not seem to notice, and she vaulted over the counter with impossible grace and crossed the distance to Danny in 3 long strides before Danny could react. She was right in front of him, and she leaned in close and inhaled deeply near his neck, and a sound started building in her chest, and it took Danny a moment to recognize it. She was purring, and it was loud, and it vibrated through the air between them. Other customers were staring now, and some were pointing and whispering, and Danny stood frozen, and his brain struggled to process what was happening. The Catwoman circled him slowly, and still purring, and her tail brushed against his legs, and she looked at him with an intensity that made his face heat up. Finally she spoke, and her voice was melodic with a slight accent that the translator could not quite smooth out. She said her name was Kira, and she asked if he was human, and when Danny nodded she made a sound that was half purr and half delighted chirp. She said she had heard about humans but had never met one, and would he please sit down and let her bring him breakfast, and it would be free and she would make him anything he wanted. Danny found himself nodding and Kira's face lit up with joy, and she guided him to the best table in the cafe, and her hand on his arm was warm through the fur. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned minutes later with a plate piled high with something that looked like eggs and bread and fruit, and she set it in front of him carefully, and then she did something Danny did not expect. She sat down across from him and put her chin in her hands and just watched him eat with rapt attention. Every time Danny took a bite, she would smile and her tail would swish happily, and when he complimented the food, she practically glowed. Other customers kept trying to get her attention, but Kira ignored them completely, and her focus was entirely on Danny, and it was flattering and also slightly overwhelming. When Danny finished eating, Kira asked if he would come back tomorrow, and her ears were forward and hopeful, and her tail had wrapped around the leg of her chair. Danny said yes because the food was good and Kira was nice even if she was a bit intense. Kira's purr got even louder and she touched his hand briefly, and her fur was incredibly soft, and she said she would make him something special. As Danny left the cafe, he could feel Kira's eyes following him, and when he glanced back, she was still watching and she waved enthusiastically. Danny waved back and headed to his first day of work and tried to ignore the warm feeling in his chest. He had no idea that his life had just become very complicated. Danny kept his promise and returned to the Nebula Rest the next morning and the morning after that, and by the end of his first week on Zenith 7, it had become part of his routine. Every day Kira would spot him coming and her ears would perk up and she would abandon whatever she was doing to greet him, and she always had his favorite table ready, and she learned exactly how he liked his coffee and what foods he preferred. She also started bringing him little gifts. The first one was a smooth blue stone she said reminded her of Earth's oceans, and she placed it carefully on his table with both hands and waited nervously for his reaction. Danny thanked her and said it was beautiful, and Kira's purr was so loud that other customers turned to look. After that, the gifts kept coming, and a piece of shimmery fabric and a small carved figurine and a cluster of crystals that glowed faintly in the dark, and Danny's room started filling up with Kira's offerings. He tried to tell her it was not necessary, but she looked so happy giving them that he did not have the heart to refuse. By the second week, Kira had started doing something new, and whenever Danny sat down, she would find an excuse to sit with him, and at first she sat across the table, but gradually she moved closer until she was sitting right beside him. Then one morning she did something that made Danny's brain short-circuit. He was halfway through his breakfast when Kira appeared with his coffee refill, and instead of sitting in the chair, she simply climbed into his lap and settled herself there like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her weight was warm and solid against him, and her tail curled around his waist, and she started purring, and the vibrations went through his whole body. Danny sat frozen with his fork halfway to his mouth, and he had no idea what to do. Kira looked up at him with those big violet eyes and asked if this was okay, and her voice was soft and hopeful. Danny's brain finally restarted, and he managed to nod, and Kira's answering smile was radiant, and she tucked her head under his chin and purred even harder. After that, it became their routine, and every morning Kira would finish her opening tasks and then claim Danny's lap as her spot, and she would curl up against him contentedly while he ate and drank his coffee. Danny found he did not mind, and Kira was warm and soft, and her purring was actually very relaxing, and other customers seemed to find it adorable. Life settled into a pleasant pattern, and Danny worked his shifts answering questions about Earth and exploring the station and spending his mornings with Kira. Then everything changed in his third week on the station. Danny needed to get his data pad repaired because he had accidentally dropped it and cracked the screen, and Zix recommended a repair shop on the tech level called Precision Works. The shop was small and crammed with equipment and spare parts, and the walls were covered with displays of alien technology, and a sign by the door promised quick repairs at fair prices. Danny walked in and called out a greeting, and a voice from the back yelled that she would be right there. Moments later, a woman emerged from behind a tall shelf, and Danny's eyes went wide. She was Felinar like Kira, but her coloring was completely different, and her fur was golden like honey, and her eyes were bright amber, and her tail had rings of darker gold. She was wiping grease off her hands with a rag, and she looked up at Danny and froze mid-step. Her ears shot straight up and her pupils dilated, and she dropped the rag, and the exact same thing happened that had happened with Kira. She crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat and leaned in and inhaled deeply near his neck and started purring, and it was just as loud as Kira's. Danny stood there wondering if this was just going to be his life now. The golden Felinar circled him slowly, and her tail brushed against him, and she looked at him like he was the most interesting thing she had ever seen. She introduced herself as Mila and asked if he was human, and when Danny confirmed it, she made a delighted chirping sound and said she had been hoping to meet one of his kind. Danny explained about his broken datapad, and Mila took it from him carefully, and their fingers touched, and she shivered and her purr got louder. She examined the damage and said it would take about an hour to fix, and would he please wait, because she wanted to talk to him. Danny agreed and sat in the chair she offered, and Mila disappeared into her workshop, but she kept coming back out. Every few minutes she would emerge with some excuse, and she needed to ask him a question about the datapad, or she wanted to show him an interesting piece of tech, or she just wanted to check if he needed anything. Each time she stayed a little longer and moved a little closer. By the time she finished the repair, she was practically sitting on his armrest, and her tail was draped across his shoulders. I handed back the datapad and asked if he would come visit again, and her ears were forward and hopeful. Danny said he would, and Mila's face lit up, and she touched his cheek briefly, and her fur was incredibly soft, and she said she would look forward to it. As Danny left the shop, he glanced back and saw Mila watching him through the window, and her tail was swishing excitedly. He had a strange feeling that things were about to get more interesting. The next morning, Danny went to the Nebula Rest, as usual, and Kira greeted him with her customary enthusiasm and climbed into his lap and started purring. Everything seemed normal, until Danny mentioned he had gotten his datapad fixed. Kira's purring stopped abruptly, and her ears flattened slightly, and she asked where he got it repaired. Danny told her about Precision Works and about Mila. Kira's tail went rigid and her pupils narrowed to thin slits, and she asked very carefully if Mila had been friendly. Danny said yes and mentioned that Mila had asked him to visit again. Kira made a sound low in her throat that was definitely not a purr, and her claws extended slightly and dug into Danny's leg through his pants. Danny yelped and asked what was wrong. Kira seemed to catch herself, and her claws retracted and she forced her ears back up, but her tail was still lashing, and she said nothing was wrong and everything was fine. But everything was clearly not fine. That afternoon, Danny decided to visit Mila's shop again because his datapad was working great and he wanted to thank her properly. Mila was thrilled to see him, and within minutes she had guided him to her favorite chair and draped herself across his lap and started grooming his hair with her rough tongue. Danny was starting to see a pattern. He was also starting to realize he might have a problem that night, as he lay in bed with Kira's gifts arranged on his shelf and the memory of both Felinar women purring in his lap. Danny stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into. Tomorrow he would find out exactly how complicated his life could get. Danny's morning started normally enough, and he went to the Nebula Rest, and Kira greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, and she had made him something special for breakfast, just like she promised. She had learned he loved pancakes, and somehow she had recreated them using station ingredients, and they were perfect and fluffy and sweet, and Danny told her they were amazing. Kira glowed with pride and climbed into his lap and purred contentedly while he ate, and her tail wrapped possessively around his waist. Everything was peaceful until Danny made a mistake. He mentioned that after breakfast he was going to stop by Mila's shop because she had offered to upgrade his datapad's processing speed for free. Kira's entire body went tense, and her purring cut off like someone had flipped a switch, and her ears flattened against her head. She asked why he needed to visit Mila again, and her voice was carefully controlled. Danny explained that it was just for the upgrade, and Mila had been really nice and helpful. Kira's tail started lashing, and she said that Mila was only being helpful because she wanted something, and did Danny know what Mila was doing? Danny asked what she meant. Kira climbed out of his lap and started pacing, and she said that Mila was courting him and bringing him to her den and grooming him and claiming his lap. And these were all traditional Felinar courtship behaviors. Danny's brain stuttered, and he asked if that was what Kira was doing. 2. Kira stopped pacing and looked at him, and her ears drooped slightly, and she said yes, and she had been courting him since the moment they met, and she thought he understood. Danny felt his face heat up, and he admitted he had not realized, and human courtship was different and less obvious. Kira's ears perked back up, and she asked if he was interested in being courted. Before Danny could answer, his communicator buzzed, and it was a message from Mila, asking if he was still coming by and she had something special to show him. Kira saw the message, and her eyes narrowed, and she said Danny should do what he wanted, but he should know that Mila was trying to steal him. Danny promised he was not being stolen, and he just wanted to be friends with both of them. Kira made a sound that suggested she did not believe Mila wanted to be just friends. Danny left the cafe feeling guilty and confused, and he was starting to understand that he had wandered into something more complicated than he realized when he arrived at Precision Works. Mila greeted him with a brilliant smile, and she had clearly groomed herself carefully, and her golden fur was shining. She showed him the upgrades she planned for his datapad, and then she gave him a gift, and it was a small holographic projector she had built herself, and it displayed images of Earth that she had found in the station's database. Danny was touched, and he thanked her, and Mila purred and rubbed her cheek against his shoulder and asked if he would like to sit with her while she worked. Danny agreed, and Mila settled him in her chair and then curled up in his lap and started working on his datapad while still draped across him. She was warm and soft, and her purr was soothing, and Danny found himself relaxing. Then Mila asked casually if he had been spending time with any other Felinar. Danny tensed and mentioned Kira. Mila's purr stuttered, and her tail stopped swishing, and she asked careful questions about how much time Danny spent at the cafe. Danny told her honestly, and Mila listened, and her ears gradually flattened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that Kira was also courting him, and Danny probably needed to make a choice. Soon Danny asked why. Mila explained that Felinar courtship was serious and it was not casual, and once a Felinar decided to court someone, they were fully committed, and having two Felinar courting the same person was not common, and it usually ended badly. She said it was not about being jealous, although that was part of it, and it was about territory and pride and instinct, and if both she and Kira kept courting Danny, eventually they would clash. Danny felt a knot form in his stomach, and he asked what would happen if they clashed. Mila said that Felinar did not usually fight physically, but they would compete and challenge each other and make life difficult, and it would be stressful for everyone, especially Danny. She looked up at him with those amber eyes and asked quietly if he had made a decision about who he preferred. Danny realized he did not have a good answer. He liked them both, and Kira was sweet and thoughtful and always knew how to make him smile, and Mila was clever and funny and made him feel appreciated. He said he needed time to think. Mila nodded and rubbed her cheek against his chest and said she understood, but he should not take too long. When Danny left the shop, he felt more confused than ever. The next day, things escalated. Danny decided to have lunch in the station plaza because he needed space to think, and he found a bench near a fountain and sat down with some food from a vendor. He was halfway through eating when both Kira and Mila appeared at the same time from opposite directions. They spotted him, and their faces lit up, and they both headed toward him. Then they spotted each other. Both Felinar stopped in their tracks, and their ears flattened and their tails puffed up to twice their normal size. They stared at each other across the plaza, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. Danny stood up and waved awkwardly and tried to defuse the situation, but neither of them looked at him. Kira moved first, and she walked toward Danny with deliberate steps, and her eyes never left. Mila responded by moving forward as well, and her shoulders were back and her chin was up. They met right in front of Danny's bench, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then Kira sat down on the bench on Danny's left side. Mila immediately sat down on his right. Both of them shifted closer until they were pressed against him, and then they both tried to climb into his lap at the same time. What followed was the most awkward moment of Danny's life. Kira claimed his left leg, and Mila took his right, and they sat rigid and tense, with their backs straight and their tails lashing. Neither would look at the other, but both kept shooting sideways glances. Their purring had turned into low growls that made the other plaza visitors back away nervously. Danny sat frozen between them, and his lunch forgotten, and he had no idea what to do. Station security approached cautiously and asked if everything was all right. Kira and Mila both turned to glare at the security officer and said in unison that everything was fine. The officer looked at Danny, and Danny managed a weak nod. The officer backed away slowly. Danny sat there with two angry Felinar women in his lap and his mind racing. He realized this could not continue, and he needed to figure out what he wanted, and more importantly, he needed to find a solution that did not end with someone getting hurt. But looking at Kira's determined face on one side and Mila's fierce expression on the other, Danny had no idea what that solution could be. The growling continued, and Danny knew he was running out of time. The situation in the plaza lasted for 20 excruciating minutes, and Kira and Mila sat rigid in Danny's lap, and neither willing to move, and both shooting deadly glares at each other. Finally, Danny could not take it anymore, and he carefully extracted himself from between them, and stood up and said he needed to go. Both Felinar looked up at him with betrayed expressions, and their ears drooped. Danny promised he would talk to them both soon, and he practically ran back to his quarters. That night, Danny could not sleep, and he stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what to do, and he genuinely liked both Kira and Mila, and choosing between them felt wrong, but he also understood that the current situation was not sustainable. The next morning, Danny's communicator buzzed early, and it was a message from Commander Thex, who ran civilian affairs on the station. The message said Danny needed to come to the commander's office immediately. Danny's stomach dropped, and he knew this was about the plaza incident. Commander Thex was a Zentari, which meant he looked like a 7-foot-tall lizard with wise eyes, and when Danny entered the office, Thex gestured for him to sit. Thex explained that there had been concerns raised about the situation with Kira and Mila, and several witnesses had reported the plaza confrontation, and while nothing violent had occurred yet, Thex needed to address this before it became a diplomatic incident. Danny asked how two Felinar fighting over him could be a diplomatic incident. Thex explained patiently that Danny was here as part of Earth's cultural exchange program, and his actions reflected on his entire species, and if his presence caused conflict between station residents, it could affect Earth's standing with the Galactic Council. Also, Thex added more gently, the commander was concerned for Danny's well-being and for Kira and Mila's well-being, and everyone involved deserved to be happy. Thex asked Danny directly what his intentions were. Danny admitted honestly that he did not know, and he cared about both of them, and choosing felt impossible. Thex's expression softened, and the commander said that was understandable, but Danny needed to make a decision soon, and Felinar courtship disputes could become intense, and it was better to resolve this cleanly. Danny left the office feeling worse than before. He spent the day avoiding both the cafe and the repair shop, and instead he wandered the station and tried to think. By evening, he had made a decision, and it was probably going to make things more complicated, but it was the only option that felt right. He sent messages to both Kira and Mila, asking them to meet him at his quarters that night. Both responded immediately with concerned questions, but Danny just said he needed to talk to them both, and it was important. At the appointed time, Danny heard a knock on his door, and he opened it to find both Kira and Mila standing there. They looked at each other with surprise and suspicion, and their ears flattened. Danny invited them both in and gestured to the small couch, and they sat on opposite ends as far apart as possible. Danny pulled up his desk chair and sat facing them, and he took a deep breath. He said he wanted to be honest with both of them, and he knew they had been courting him, and he understood that was serious in their culture. Both Felinar watched him intently, and their tails were tense. Danny continued and said he cared about both of them, and he had thought about this constantly, and he could not choose between them because choosing would mean hurting someone he cared about, and he would not do that. Kira's ears drooped, and Mila looked down at her hands. Danny said he understood if that was not acceptable, and he knew their culture probably did not work that way, and if they wanted to stop courting him, he would understand, and he valued their friendship above everything. There was a long silence. Then Kira spoke quietly and asked what Danny was saying. Danny took another breath and said that if there was any way, any possibility that they could both be with him, he wanted to try that, and he knew it was probably against their customs, and he was just a human who did not understand everything about their culture, but he was asking if they would consider it. Another silence, and this one even longer. Mila was the first to react, and she looked up at Kira, and something passed between them, and it was a complicated look full of surprise and consideration and wariness. Kira met Mila's eyes, and her ears twitched forward slightly. Mila spoke first, and her voice was thoughtful, and she said that Felinar actually did have a tradition for shared courtship, but it was very rare and it required both parties to agree completely. Kira added that it was called a family bond, and it meant that instead of competing as rivals, the two Felinar would become partners, and they would share territory and resources, and bond as family. Both of them would court Danny equally, and neither would have priority. Mila said it also meant she and Kira would have to respect each other and work together and put Danny's happiness above their individual pride. Kira said the most important part was that all three of them would have to agree, and all three would have to commit fully, and if anyone was uncertain, it would not work. Danny felt hope rising in his chest, and he asked if they would be willing to try. Kira and Mila looked at each other again, and this time the look lasted longer. Finally, Kira said that keeping Danny happy was more important than tradition, and if sharing meant she could still court him, she would agree. Mila said that she would rather share Danny than lose him completely, and if Kira was willing to try, then so was she. But both of them looked at Danny seriously, and Kira said this was not a casual decision, and once they committed to a family bond, it was permanent. Mila added that Danny would have to commit too, and he would belong to both of them equally, and he could not favor one over the other. Danny said he understood and he was willing to try, and he would do his best to make them both happy. Kira stood up first and crossed to Danny, and she took his hands, and she asked if he was absolutely certain. Danny said yes. Mila joined them, and she touched Danny's shoulder and asked the same question. Danny said yes again. Both Felinar looked at each other one more time, and then they nodded. Kira said they would start the bonding rituals tomorrow, and there were ceremonies they needed to perform and traditions to follow. Mila said it would take time for them to adjust to each other, but they would try. Then something unexpected happened. Kira turned to Mila and extended her hand, and Mila took it, and they touched foreheads briefly. It was a gesture of respect and agreement. When they separated, both of them looked more relaxed, and their tails were no longer rigid. Kira climbed into Danny's lap on his left side, and Mila settled on his right, and for the first time they both started purring together. The sound was incredible, and it harmonized and filled the small room. Danny wrapped his arms around both of them and felt their warmth and their soft fur. And he thought, maybe, just maybe, this could actually work. Outside his window, the station glittered with lights, and inside his quarters, 3 people sat together and tried to figure out how to build something new. It would not be easy, but Danny was determined to try. Both Kira and Mila seemed to feel the same way as they sat together purring and planning. Danny realized that sometimes the best solutions were the ones nobody expected. The bonding ceremony happened 3 days later in a small traditional chamber that Kira had reserved on the station's cultural level. Danny wore his best clothes, which were not very impressive, but Kira and Mila both assured him he looked perfect, and their purring suggested they meant it. The ceremony itself was beautiful and surprisingly simple. A Felinar elder named Vera officiated, and she was ancient with silver fur and kind eyes, and she had performed family bondings before, though she admitted it had been many years. Vera explained that the family bond was about commitment and trust and respect, and all 3 of them would make vows to each other. Kira went first, and she took Danny's hands and promised to honor him and care for him and share her life with him. And then she turned to Mila and promised to treat her as family and respect her bond with Danny. Mila made similar vows, and her voice was steady and sincere. Then it was Danny's turn, and he promised to love them both equally and to never favor one over the other and to build a life with them together. Vera blessed the bond and gave each of them a small crystal pendant that glowed with soft light, and she said these would remind them of their commitment. When the ceremony ended, Kira and Mila both hugged Danny, and then hesitantly they hugged each other. It was awkward at first, but genuine. Over the next few weeks, they fell into new routines. Mornings, Danny would visit the Nebula Rest and Kira would greet him with coffee and breakfast and sit with him while he ate, and they would talk about their plans for the day. Afternoons, he would stop by Precision Works, and Mila would show him whatever project she was working on, and he would sit with her and keep her company while she tinkered. Evenings, all three of them would meet at Danny's quarters, which were getting crowded, and they would share dinner and watch station broadcasts and just exist together. The lap situation resolved itself naturally, and they took turns, and sometimes both of them would curl up with Danny on the couch and their purring would blend together in that incredible harmony. Kira and Mila slowly became friends. It started with small things, and Mila fixed the coffee maker at the Nebula Rest when it broke, and Kira brought lunch to Precision Works when Mila got too focused on a project to eat. They started coordinating their schedules, so Danny was never alone, and they would send each other messages about his preferences and his mood. Danny watched them grow closer with relief and happiness. There were still moments of tension and old instincts died hard, and sometimes one of them would get possessive or jealous. Once Kira got upset when Mila bought Danny a gift without telling her, and she felt like Mila was trying to outdo her. Mila snapped back that she was not competing and she just saw something Danny would like. They argued for about 5 minutes while Danny sat between them anxiously. Then Kira stopped and took a breath and apologized and said, "Old habits were hard to break." Mila apologized too and admitted she should have mentioned the gift idea to Kira first. They hugged it out, and Danny reminded them that he appreciated gifts from both of them equally, and he did not compare them. After that, they got better at communicating. Commander Thex checked in with Danny a month after the ceremony and asked how things were going. Danny reported honestly that there were challenges, but overall, everyone was happy, and the situation was stable. Thex seemed satisfied and said Earth's diplomats would be pleased, and Danny was setting a good example of human adaptability. Danny's friends back on Earth would never believe this story. The station community gradually accepted the unusual arrangement, and other residents grew accustomed to seeing Danny with both Kira and Mila. The regular customers at the Nebula Rest thought it was sweet, and the other shop owners on the tech level congratulated. Mila, a few Felinar, approached Kira and Mila with questions about the family bond, and apparently word was spreading that the old tradition still worked. 2 months into the bond, Danny woke up with both Kira and Mila curled around him in bed, and they had started sleeping over regularly, and his quarters were officially too small. They decided to request bigger quarters together. The housing office approved their request without question, and they moved into a 3-room suite with an actual bedroom and living space, and a small kitchen. Kira decorated with soft fabrics and plants, and Mila added her collection of interesting tech and gadgets, and Danny contributed his Earth belongings. It felt like home. One evening, all three of them sat on their new couch watching the station's news broadcast, and Kira was in Danny's lap, and Mila was pressed against his side, and both were purring contentedly. Danny realized he had not felt this happy in years and maybe ever. He said out loud that he was glad he came to Zenith 7. Kira looked up at him and said she was glad too, and she could not imagine her life without him. Now Mila added that finding Danny was the best thing that ever happened to her, and sharing him with Kira had given her a sister as well as a partner. Kira and Mila smiled at each other, and it was warm and genuine. Danny felt his chest swell with emotion, and he pulled them both closer. The three of them sat together in comfortable silence, and the only sound was their synchronized purring and the distant hum of the station. Danny thought about his old life on Earth and his tiny apartment and his boring job, and he could barely remember why he had been so nervous about coming to space. This was where he belonged, with Kira, who brought him breakfast every morning and knew exactly how to make him smile, and who left little gifts around their quarters for him to find. With Mila, who challenged him to games and fixed everything before it broke, and who made him laugh with her clever observations. With both of them who had chosen to share him instead of competing, and who had become family to each other because they loved him. Danny Foster from Ohio had come to the stars looking for adventure, and he found something better. He found home later that night. As they prepared for bed, Kira mentioned that her family wanted to meet Danny, and they lived on the Felinar homeworld, and they could visit during his next leave period. Mila added that her family wanted to meet him too, and maybe they could visit both families. Danny agreed enthusiastically and asked if his families would mind the unusual arrangement. Kira laughed and said, Our families were complicated already, and one more unusual bond would not shock anyone. Mila added that if anything, her mothers would be impressed that she had managed to share successfully, as Danny drifted off to sleep with Kira on one side and Mila on the other, and their tails intertwined across his chest. He thought about the future. 6 months had seemed like a long time when he first signed up for the exchange program. Now it seemed far too short. He would have to extend his contract, and maybe permanently, Earth would always be home. But this was home too. Here with his 2 impossible, wonderful, fierce-loving partners who had fought over his lap and then decided to share it. Danny smiled in the darkness and listened to their purring, and felt their warmth and knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. All of them had sometimes the best. Solutions were the ones nobody expected, and sometimes family was something you built rather than something you were born into. And sometimes a guy from Ohio could travel to the stars and find 2 alien cat girls who would change his life forever. Danny fell asleep happy and surrounded by love and ready for whatever adventures came next. Because now he would not face them alone. He had Kira and Mila by his side, and that made everything possible.